Cease. Stop. Have we done that today? When did we begin ceasing? Well, hopefully we're still alive, but when did we begin our cease? Did we begin ceasing last Sabbath as Sabbath began last night at sunset? Shabbath, S-H-A-B-A-T-H, means in part to cease. As God ceased his creative work, we are commanded to cease from our work during that 24-hour period. I just was thinking as we were sitting and listening to Mrs. Hogberg play that piece. It was restful and peaceful, and it helped us cease, didn't it? It was music that helped us cease and take in the tranquility of the beauty of God's way of life and the beauty of music itself that God created. Let's turn to Exodus 20 to begin. We're going to talk about Sabbath-keeping today. I think we're familiar with that. I think most of us are very, very familiar with Sabbath-keeping. Many of us have been keeping the Sabbath all our lives. We don't know anything else but keeping the Sabbath. Others of us were called out of the world and introduced to this precious truth that involved the Sabbath-keeping command. We're going to talk about that today, but we're going to talk about it and spend a good bit of time as we get into the heart of the message about ceasing, about C-E-A-S-I-N-G. Are we ceasing? Are we ceasing as a family? Are we ceasing as individuals as we keep this day that God gives us every week? Any of you that have read the booklet that we recently put out knows that one of the things that is very intriguing about the 7-day cycle, the 7-day week that we have, is that there's no real need for it in terms of the solar calendar and you know, the year that it takes for the earth to go around the sun. And yet there are 7 days. There's nothing that the 7 days that requires there to be 7 days in terms of making a year occur. And yet 7 days in a week have continued down through the ages. I think it was said that there was one individual that was in a position of influence that tried to get it changed to a 10-day week, but it never really coalesced. And here we are still coming back from Recreation Week when God reestablished everything and refurbished the earth and created man on that 6th day and rested on that 7th. We are still doing 7 days in a week. Exodus 20 speaks to that today as we see an aspect of the Sabbath. The Sabbath is very important for us to understand that the Sabbath and Sabbath-keeping is both restrictive and liberating. So growing up in the church, those of you that have, what was emphasized in your family? Was the emphasis of it being restrictive? You can't do this, can't do that, can't do that. No, if you want to do it, can't do that on Sabbath. Or was it liberating without rules? You know, was it one or the other? Or was it a happy harmony of both restrictions and also liberation? What is that like now for you? How do you view the Sabbath? How would you say, parents, how would you say your children view the Sabbath? Do they view the Sabbath as restrictive? I can't wait for that sun to set because I've got this and this and this and this and this to do. Or do they view the Sabbath as we keep the Sabbath in our families as liberating, as a ceasing and a joyous ceasing? Let's look at that as we see some of the teachings here in Exodus 20, because Exodus 20 states and Deuteronomy 5 state that both are at work here. We won't turn to Deuteronomy 5, but Deuteronomy 5, as we know, it reminds us that we were once in Egypt. We were Israelites in Egypt, and we were removed from that slave situation as slaves to Egypt. I, God, have liberated you from that. I, God, have brought you out of the mud and the muck and the mire that Mr. Hogberg was alluding to with World War I and what the world is now. I've brought you out of that. You have been liberated from that. And every week, every Sabbath that we keep the Sabbath and keep it to God, we recognize how we've been liberated from that. And otherwise, we wouldn't know that we were in the muck and the mire. Or we would know we're in muck and mire and we don't know why. But he has liberated us from that. But we also see the restrictions. There are both. Exodus 20, verse 8. He says, remember it. Call it to memory. Call it to mind. This Sabbath day, to keep it holy. To keep it holy. This term holy is the Hebrew word kadash. Qadash. And it means God causatively made it. He causatively announced or causatively observed it and said that it is clean, it is pure, it is to be hallowed. So he says, keep that holy, keep it in that kind of manner to make clean. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the eternal, your God, the Sabbath of Yahweh, your God. It's his Sabbath, and in it you shall do no work. And not only that, but your son shouldn't be doing work. Your daughter shouldn't. Your male servant, your female servant, your cattle, nor your stranger who's within your gates. And that's a very important point to make. We talk about this from time to time, but you are in control of your dwelling place, as I am in control of mine. And as I have people come and do work for me, be it roofing the house or doing this project or this project, I need to make sure, since that is my domain, that I don't bring people in to do that kind of labor on the Sabbath day. Now, obviously, there are oxes in the ditch that occasionally you've got an emergency and it needs to get taken care of. But do we protect that time, and do we, as masters of our house, create a situation where it is a time for everyone to rest? He says, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that's in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed that day. God blessed that day, and he hallowed it. He hallowed it. So we're to remember it. It is restrictive in that no work is to be done. We're not to be doing work on that day, and it's God's Sabbath. He also, in verse 11, he points us back to this time that happened before he entered into this covenant, this fourth commandment of the tablets of the testimony. He harkens back all the way to creation. Let's go back to creation. These are very familiar verses to us, but it's important for us to think about this as we move into the discussion of ceasing. Are we ceasing? Are your children, our children, ceasing? Genesis 2, verse 1, mentions what happened as God refurbished the earth and set it all up and created the animals, created man, the pinnacle of his creation, and then he has one more aspect of the creation that he does on the seventh day, this creation of a rest. Genesis 2, verse 1, so thus the heavens and the earth and all the host of them were finished. They were kala, they were ceased, they were ended. So it was all finished at that time. And then we see the same word kala here in verse 2. And on the seventh day, God kala, he ceased. He finished his work. He ended his work, which he had done. And he rested. He reposed. He desist from exertion. I could have started the sermon that way. Desist from exertion. But are we doing that? Are we desisting from exertion as God did? He rested on the seventh day. That he rested. He did that Shabbath. He Shabbathed on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day. And God is the one who kadashed it. God sanctified. He made it clean. He made it holy. And he rested because in it he rested from all his work which God created and made. This is the history of the heavens and the earth, which were when they were created, in the day that the Lord God made the heaven and the earth. So the heavens and the earth. So we see this final stamp that God puts on his creation is this seventh day of ceasing, of rest. This predates the formation of Israel. Let's go to one other passage as we introduce this, because let's go back a chapter, because some will talk about, well, yeah, you see the Sabbath as being discussed way back then, but you don't see the holy days being discussed. You don't really see the holy days being discussed in detail about what to do and all of this until he begins to deal with Israel. Does that mean that the holy days were not in effect, or can we definitively say, no, they were not in effect at all until God began to work with Israel and call them out of the land? I don't think we can say that, and in part because we understand the aspect of what Genesis is. Genesis is a book about beginnings. It's not a book that discusses the detailed specifics of things. We see that the Sabbath was way back here. Could other things have been way back here? And many of you are familiar with this, but let's look here in Genesis 1, verse 14, because a very interesting term is used. As God is, the earth becomes without form and void, and God comes in and begins refashioning everything each day and bringing things back to order and setting everything in place. And he begins to set the stars and the lights and the firmament of the heavens and gets them in place again after what we understand to be what happened between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, the rebellion of Satan and the earth becoming in this state of being waste and emptiness. So God's refurbishing and refashioning and repositioning everything. Verse 14, so then God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from night, and let them be for signs and seasons. I think the Hebrew word there is that moed, M-O-E-D, signs and seasons, and for days and for years. And that term moed is, again, this term is used here, and of course it's predating Israel. Israel wasn't on the scene yet, but the term there is properly an appointment. That is a fixed time or season, specifically a festival, conventionally a year, by implication an assembly. So appointing specifically fixed times. So very well could have been God was establishing that at the beginning, the set times and the seasons for these days. Not that they, again, even though they weren't identified in particular until Exodus, they could have been in place by what we see set up here in Creation Week, as God setting up these moeds, these festivals, these fixed times or appointments throughout the year. So that's a little bit of the doctrinal background. Let's get into a little bit now this aspect of ceasing by going to Isaiah 58. Again, most of us that have studied the Sabbath and studied the keeping of the Sabbath would immediately think of Isaiah 58. I'm going to read it from the Tanakh. But while you're turning there, one of the things that we always need to talk about when we think about this aspect of ceasing is the statement that Christ makes in Mark 2:27. What's he say in Mark 2:27? Very important. The Sabbath was made for man. God, the Creator, made the Sabbath for mankind. He made it in that creation week on the seventh day. He made it for mankind's purpose. Part of the thing that Christ was getting at them and defending was that the Jews had twisted it to where, as it says, the Sabbath was made for man, not man made for the Sabbath. Man wasn't made for the purpose of the Sabbath. The Sabbath is not the end all. The Sabbath is not everything points to the Sabbath. No, the Sabbath was made for man to help mankind understand God as Creator and to help man understand that God has delivered them from Egypt, from spiritual Egypt. It's not that we are created for the Sabbath. And the Jews had gotten, so they wanted to protect the keeping of the Sabbath so much that they had created a system that man was made for the Sabbath. And that gets to where it got people thinking in a wonky way. And as we look down through the ages of the church and the challenges that we've had as a church down through the years, part of that comes from that lack of understanding that the Sabbath was made for man. Man wasn't made for the Sabbath. Jesus Christ is the Lord of the Sabbath. He's the one who created the Sabbath along with his Father for mankind. Very important to understand. So once we understand that and once we get that distinction, then we keep the Sabbath in perspective for what its purpose is. So again, I would ask us as parents, how do our children view the Sabbath? Do they view it in that way? Have we helped them, or do we create an environment to help them understand that? Do we understand that? Do we understand that and grasp that? I submit that we do. But do we continue to grasp that in an ever-deepening way? So we see a very familiar passage now in Isaiah 58. Again, I'm going to read it from the Tanakh, which is the Hebrew to English Jewish Publication Society translation. But I like the way they read that as we talk about what is it to cease? What is it to cease on the Sabbath? Isaiah 58, verse 13, he says here, if you refrain, or we could also say, as the margin renders, literally, turn back your feet from. My feet are going down this path that's wrong, and I'm going to turn my feet from that and go down this path. If you refrain from trampling on the Sabbath, trampling on it, stomping on it, and smashing it down, he says, if you will do this, and then he explains what trampling the Sabbath is. He says it in another way, from pursuing your affairs on my holy day. That gets to how we can trample on the Sabbath. So I want us to think about that today. I want to really, really explore that as we get into the message. Do we find ourselves trampling on God's Sabbath day? And do we find ourselves doing that by pursuing our affairs on God's holy day? He says, no, instead, if you call the Sabbath delight, the Lord's holy day, honored, esteemed. And if you honor it and not go your own ways, and go not your ways, nor look to your affairs, nor in the process of striking bargains, working out financial situations, then if you can seek the favor, then as a result of doing it the right way, he says, then you can seek the favor of the eternal. I will set you astride the heights of the earth, and I'm going to let you enjoy the heritage of your father Jacob, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. How do we cease from pursuing our affairs on God's holy day? Not doing the normal kinds of affairs. What are the normal kinds of affairs? Well, the normal kinds of affairs mean dealing with the normal kinds of things that we do during the week. May not be sinful, but they're the normal kinds of affairs. The chores, the work, the business of earning an income. Do I, as a business owner, which I am not, but those of you who are, men and women, business owners that are very responsible for a variety of things, do I not trample on the Sabbath by putting that clear? Or am I checking my iPhone? Am I checking this? Well, they're touching in with me here. Well, I just need to make a quick little thing to let them know, no, don't do this, don't do this. Yeah, and I'll deal with the major stuff on Saturday night when sunset hits, but I'll just stay in touch. Do we completely pull back from that? Do we make it clear? Do we make it clear to the people who work for us? Do we make it clear for the people whom we oversee in different things that we may not be able to control in certain situations what they're doing, but do we make it clear to them that I'm not going to be responding to you on the things that you want from me with respect to this job on the Sabbath, because I want to keep God's holy day honored. I want to call the Sabbath delight. I want to refrain from pursuing my own affairs on God's great holy day. So that's something. The entertainment that we choose. Not that all entertainment is wrong, like going to see the Rough Riders play baseball. Is that a sin? No, it's not a sin at all. Is eating more than one beef hot dog a sin, which it's $1 beef hot dog night at Rough Riders night? I will probably eat more than one. Will that be a sin? No, I will enjoy it with mustard and pickle relish. But I will not have onions on it because I hate onions on my hot dog. I'm going to enjoy that event. But is that part of pursuing my own affairs? Yes. I want to steer clear of that. So we stay away from the typical types of entertainment that we would normally be involved in during the week. We stay away from the athletic endeavors that are not part of calling the Sabbath a delight. We're not checking on the news to see who won this ball game and this ball game and this and that and watching this ball game or participating in these kinds of activities. That is pursuing our own affairs on the Sabbath. We listen to an appropriate kind of music. Not that there aren't certain types of music that are appropriate to listen to during the week, but they're not the kinds of things that take it to the point where we pull away from our own affairs that we're dealing with during the week and call the Sabbath a delight. Some people are very careless with what they choose to listen to and just listen to anything that does not put them in a frame of mind that helps us pull back and reflect upon this wonderful day that God gives us that is a ceasing from what we normally deal with. How have you guys, how have you as family members, how have you as an individual, how do you make the Sabbath a delight? So let's answer that. How have you made the Sabbath a delight so far? What did it start with last night when sunset hit? What did you do as a family? If you're not part of a family, if you're an individual living on your own, what did you do to cause the Sabbath to be a delight? What did you intentionally do? What do we intentionally do? What do we do this morning to call the Sabbath a delight? Did we roll out of bed at 12:30 just in time to get a shower and get here in services, and we're still tired, so we can get back home right after we hear the amen, get another nap in so I can hit the ground running at 8:32 or whenever the sunset is, and be able to really rock and roll all night? You know, what have we done? What have we done as a family to make the Sabbath a delight? To cease from our own affairs. I know that many families have different traditions that they do, and many of you have done things and did things already this Sabbath with your family that, wow, it brings us to the state of mind that we need to be as we come here to worship God in this holy convocation. But for many, it's a special meal. Friday night is that special meal that we have, where we have a certain type of music, fine dinnerware, an after-dinner treat that we don't normally have during the week. Getting out in creation, going out for a drive in the country, parking by a beautiful vista, by a river, by a lake, the places that are out there, even in the city environment in which we live. But getting away so we can step back and reflect. You know, one of the things that we used to love to do when we lived in the East Texas area is we loved to go to Tyler. There was a park when Stacy, our oldest, was little. There was a park there called Bergfeld Park. It was not a huge park, but it was in the Azalea district of Tyler. And we'd go to Bergfeld Park. They put fire ant killer on the grass, and there were no mosquitoes, which are two musts for me to have an enjoyable, delightful Sabbath. But anyway, we would go there, spread out our blanket. Lisa would make this pistachio green pudding that's mainly whipped cream, delicious, decadent, but very good, and I tried to eat appropriate amounts of it, but all kinds of different foods, and we would just sit and enjoy that time there at the blanket. And then we would go and walk around and see the azaleas when they were in bloom. And even sometimes, and I say this with a degree of caution, because each of us has to reflect upon what is appropriate and what's not appropriate to do on the Sabbath. But one thing that we did as a family was we would go to the Tyler Zoo. Now, I wouldn't advocate that in every situation, but we would go to services in the morning, have a nice picnic, and then the Tyler Zoo was a small little zoo. It wasn't like super touristy and blaring music, and the environment was very peaceful. It was free, and we'd go and maybe, you know, when Stacy was little, maybe spend an hour there and just walk around and see the beautiful animals, and not make a day of it to where it's this huge event, but a way to help us, again, see that the Sabbath was made for man to help us appreciate God as creator and to experience that rest and repose that God intends for us to have. But those kinds of things, a picnic in the park, getting together with brethren to enjoy that. One of the prettiest places that I've found in Dallas is the Dallas Arboretum. I just love that place. My wife and I decided to put a little bit more money down to where we could get a free year's pass. We get free parking. and we can take up to 5 people. So if you beg hard enough, I might take you. But we go there, and we have we're not able to do it on the Sabbath because I run the circuit. But if I didn't run the circuit, if I just went to Sherman, and as the weather cools down, I may set that up in the schedule to do that. But to go over there, have a nice picnic on the beautiful lawns there, and just walk around and see the incredible flora as you look out across, what is that, White Rock Lake, but to see that, it's spectacular, it's beautiful, and it helps us pull back to see this great creator that God gave us. God wants us to rest. God wants us to cease. He wants us to stop once a week. So many ways that we can call the Sabbath a delight. Some really struggle with the fact that I'm alone. I have no one. I have no one to do this or this or this. You talk about doing this with the family, and you talk about doing that with the family. Well, I ain't got nobody. What am I supposed to do? And part of that, too, is pulling back and seeing with appreciation what we do have. We do have the brethren. We do have one another to fellowship with. I see Ethel Gray back there today. Ethel Gray, I can tell you, is pretty pumped up about being able to be with God's people. Is that right, Ethel? Okay, she said yes. Okay, I see her head nodding too. Okay, I really think she believes that. She is really happy to be here. For folks that don't have that opportunity, when they can get here and health permits them to do that, they are charged to be with God's people, to fellowship with their spiritual family. But for those of us that are alone and work hard during the week and we're busy, we have the chance to pull back and spend extra time in studying a topic, even in more detail than we would normally be able to, a scriptural topic. But time with the families, just relaxing, downtime, sleeping in a bit, free-flowing conversation, Bible games, reading a Bible story. Our kids, especially Stacy, loved when we'd read Bible stories on Friday night, and we'd kind of get a little theatrical at times, and Goliath would have an extra deep voice, and David's wouldn't be as deep, but he would be pretty tough and confident. And I got to thinking she probably enjoyed my theatrical interpretation more than the actual story because she wanted to keep hearing that. But I tried to always keep it biblical. But reading the Bible study, bringing them in to God's way of life and talking about that. But time with the brethren, time for religious instruction at the weekly convocation, time for singing, time for listening to beautiful music that we did today. This is part of what God gives us so that we can cease, that we can pull out of the mud that we deal with. Let me ask you this, because one of the things that the Sabbath, as we use it as God intends, the Sabbath can create an opportunity for us as God's people to interact with one another on a deeper level than we can normally. And I'll say this, it is difficult at services. We can find little nooks and crannies to get and talk and get into some deep conversations, but it's difficult. It's difficult to get below the surface conversation and get to deep, meaningful conversation. I mean, we do need to know how each other's doing. We do need to know how this was going and how this is going. But how do we get into those deeper level conversations? I will submit to you that part of services, after services, before services, is to talk about some of those deeper level things, but to use God's Sabbath day separate of services to connect on a deeper level is critical as well. When was the last time that you were invited to another member's home or you were invited to get together with other members? When was the last time that happened for you? Think about that. Think about this. When was the last time that you invited someone over to your home or invited someone out for an activity after services? When was the last time that we did that? When was the last time at services that you reached out to someone you didn't know? That you said, I don't know who that is. When was the last time that you reached out to that person to meet that person and welcome them, to find out that they've been here for 7 or 8 years? But when does that happen? Let me ask this. Raise your hand and hold your hand up. How many of you have begun attending in this congregation within the last 3 years? Raise your hand if you have. Put them up high. Folks, look around. I mean, that's almost a fourth of our congregation. You can put them down now. But a lot of folks are new here. And if we said the last 5 years, it would probably be closer to a third of the congregation. But we have new folks coming in. Here's a project we're going to try this fall. This fall or this winter, depending on how we can get this situated. We met with a group met last week, and we decided we would try this. Here's what we're going to try. We're going to set up a list, 2 lists. Okay, the one list says, I am willing to host 10 or more people at my house on a Saturday night. And the other list says, I'm willing to go to wherever you assign me to that person's house. And it could be a family that's got a big house and can host up to 30. You list how many you can host. And just so you know, too, lest you consider bankruptcy in serving the brethren, what we want to do is it will be a church activity. So we will subsidize the entree of the family that's hosting. So they can cover the entree, and then we'll have other folks bring side dishes and such, whatever the theme of that family wants to have. But then we'll get the elders together, and I'll be involved in this, and we'll be the masterminds. And we're going to place people with people that they may not know or that they may not know really well. And we're going to create an environment where one Saturday night we're going to do that. We're all going to go to these different places where we're assigned. So jump in on that. And if you love to host and you've got the space to be able to do it, and again, to really make it work, you need to be able to host probably about 10 or more. But if you can do it, we would love to have you do it. And we just want to create that opportunity where we get to interact with one another. It's hard in a big congregation. As I've told you before, I continue to marvel at the way that the Dallas congregation is as hospitable as it is. So many things are going on, and so many folks are constantly hosting individuals, inviting people to get together in different scenarios and different environments, and we thank you for that. But we want to continue to ratchet that up. Okay, now, I'm going to get back into the subject of ceasing. It was about a week and a half ago. I was driving down the road in the evening, and I think it was a Sunday, but it was NPR. I was listening to NPR. I listen to NPR once in a while, but there was this radio show going on there, and this guy was talking. He's an author of a book, and he was talking about how his family began to realize something was terribly wrong. He said, we always had this time, either on a Friday night or a weekend night, where we had our meal. We sat down as a family, and afterwards we retired to the living room, and we began to have our talk and just talk and share the week. But he said, I began to notice over time that we still did our little get-together, and we didn't bring all of our digital, social, iPhone stuff with us to the table. We didn't bring that to the table, but we got together and we had dinner. And then we retired to the living room. So, and then we're sitting there, and we don't have our cell phones and everything, but at some point, one of the family member would say, well, that's right, I need to just go check something. Then they would go check something, and they didn't come back. And then the next one would say, well, I need to go check something. And then they would go check something, and they didn't come back. And then it was just a family of 3, just the one child. Whichever one it was sitting in the living room all by himself or herself, and, well, I've got nothing to do. I'm going to go get my iPhone and go see what's going on. And even on their family night, they were separate and into their media. And he began to realize that we are separating, even as a family. We are not connected with one another. So they decided to rest from technology. And they did it from Friday night until Monday morning. And it was brutal. It was just brutal. Can you, those of you that are involved in that work, can you imagine pulling away from technology from Friday night until Monday? It's like that commercial where it's been 35 seconds since the internet's down. You know, that kind of a thing. I'm going to lose it. But can you imagine that? And he said it was really, really awkward. He said we would just kind of be sitting around. It was just nothing much was really happening. But in time, we began to realize we can talk. We can do things. We can walk. We can go out here. We can go out here in the woods and kick around and talk and enjoy. And then they began to really, really enjoy it. Do you know what they called it? They called it a digital Sabbath. They don't care about the Sabbath. They just know it's that quaint thing that the Jews do, but that they stopped doing what they normally do. But they called it a digital Sabbath. Social media, technology, it's not evil. And in fact, the church, I know Kelly Hogg is involved with this, others, but they're in the process of putting together even greater ways that we can connect through social media, through technology, through blogs, Sabbath blogs, but just great ways for young people to connect with others. You know, we see each other at camp, and then we don't see each other all year, but then we can connect through all of these various forms of media and great snippets of information here or there in blogs, great tools to use on the Sabbath. So I'm not hounding or harping on social media, but what folks are beginning to discover, and you know this because we know it in our own lives, they're beginning to discover the addictive nature of it. The addictive nature of it to where it is taking up our time. It's not that it's just so much involved with what we do with work, but even when we have downtime, we find ourselves looking at this screen. I mean, the screen, it's really little. And that's how the people's lives are in this little screen. I mean, that's really kind of amazing. I'm looking out the window here. It's a little bit bigger than that. But people's lives are filled by that. Dale Bynum was telling me in Sherman today, he takes a class at Collin Community College. I think it's Collin, but he said there's this area where it's just this really long series of steps that go down. And he said the other day he saw 6 people walking down it, and they were all looking at their phone as they're going down these steps. He said, this is deadly. But it's so much pulling in. And yet there are, which is better? Is it better to have 400 to 1,750 friends and to be able to check and see what's going on here and here in this person's life and checking up here and checking up here? Or is it better to have a situation where I spend quality time interacting at a very deep level with another individual about something meaningful? I'm not saying that the social butterfly thing is a bad thing, and I'm not saying it's righteous to have one good friend. But the importance of ceasing and focusing in and having meaningful interaction with God's people is critical, especially on God's Sabbath. Being accessible, no matter where we are in the world, at any time with a cell phone is an incredible thing. Being accessible anywhere in the world at any time is an awful thing. It's both. It's both. And do we as God's people, do we know that it's okay to turn that thing off, to separate ourselves from it? Because otherwise it's like dog and the squirrel. You know, squirrel, we can't, it is so difficult to focus in on the things that are truly, deeply meaningful. There is a physiological response. Endorphins are released when we have that ping or that doo-doo-doo or whatever that noise is, that when someone has contacted us, oh, someone's contacting me. They like me. They want to interact with me. This is incredible. Yes, I'm eating this incredible meal with my wife right now, and we're talking about deep things, but someone's interested in talking to me. I think I'll go. You know, it's interesting how it can rule our lives. It can pull us away from the task at hand. One of the things that we think about getting out as we did last year on the Colorado camping trip, or summer camp, or nature walks, or time with friends, doing an activity, talking to someone, eating a meal together, being in close proximity with one another, all these kinds of quality interactions. It was interesting. I did not ask for this information. It just came out at checkout this year at Camp Carter. So Lisa and I are there at the table. The parents are coming in and checking out their kids. And of course, they have to turn in their cell phones. They have to turn in all their electronic devices before camp. And I'm telling you, there were at least 3 or 4 kids that came and got their phones after a week of camp, and they said, just feels really weird. It's just, it feels weird in my hand. And because they realize this is so much a part of my life, yet I've been without it for a week. And I've been interacting with folks. We've been doing things. We've been engaged in this and that. I've had conversation. I haven't even really thought about this thing. But then it's back. It's back, and it's a very important, then can become a very important thing in their lives. And I'm not saying, again, that it's necessarily bad. But it speaks to the situation of there being this whole world out there that God wants us to experience. And it comes to this discussion of one of the major important things about God's Sabbath day. And again, it's not something that we don't do any other time of the week, but it's very, very important. This is nothing that we don't know. But it is so important. Are we doing this? Are we creating a situation where our children can do this? But are we doing this? Are we spending time reflecting? Are we spending time meditating? Are we spending time turning off the squirrel? Are we turning that off and spending time with God in deep, meaningful thought and reflection? In an article titled Age of Distraction, Why It's Crucial for Students to Learn to Focus, by Katrina Schwartz on December 5th, 2013, she writes this, and bear with me on this, because this is critical. It's critical for us as God's people, especially as we reflect upon the Sabbath. It's critical for us as parents as we work with our children, because this is what's happening in society. This is what's happening in the Western world. The real message is because attention is under siege more than it has ever been in human history. We have more distractions than ever before. We have to be more focused on cultivating the skills of attention, says Daniel Goleman, a psychologist and author. They mention several things that he's written. He says, children I'm particularly worried about because the brain is the last organ of the body to become anatomically mature. It keeps growing until the mid-20s, Goleman said. If young students don't build up the neural circuitry that focused attention requires, they could have problems controlling their emotions and being empathetic. Tying that to being able to control emotions and be empathetic. It's about using the devices smartly, but having the capacity to concentrate as you need to when you want to. The circuitry for paying attention is identical to the circuits for managing distressing emotion, Goleman said. The area of the brain that governs focus and executive functioning is known as the prefrontal cortex. This is also the part of the brain that allows people to control themselves, to control their emotions, to keep their emotions in check, and to feel empathy for other people. The attentional circuitry needs to have the experience of sustained episodes of concentration, like this. Here we are, an hour to an hour and 10, hopefully closer to an hour as we go through the message. But this is a sustained episode of concentration. How are you doing? Are you able to concentrate? Now, part of it depends upon the boring spectrum of the speaker. I'm trying to keep us going here. But how effective are we at that? How effective are we as young people to keep our focus maintained? He advocates for a digital Sabbath every day, sometime when kids aren't being distracted by devices at all. He'd also like to see schools building exercises that strengthen attention. He says the ability to focus is a secret element to success that often gets ignored. Listen to this. The more you can concentrate, the better you'll do on anything. Because whatever talent you have, you can't apply it if you are distracted, Goleman said. He pointed to research on athletes showing that when given a concentration test, the results accurately predicted how well each would perform in a game the next day. And this is very telling here. This study, it was a longitudinal study that took place over years. Perhaps the most well-known study on concentration, conducted with over 1,000 children in New Zealand, by a couple of individuals professors at Duke University. They tested children born in 1972 and 1973. And they tested them regularly for 8 years, measuring their ability to pay attention and to focus and to ignore distractions. Then the researchers tracked those same children at the age of 32. So they went back to all these years later at the age of 32 to see how well they fared in life. And do you know what was the strongest predictor of success? You know what they say in education? What I was taught in education in the classes that I took, the most important factor to education, to success, is always socioeconomic status. That's what they always say. The financial wealth of the family is the greatest predictor of whether or not that child will be successful. That's what they always taught. Another one that they taught was IQ. But this test revealed something much different. The ability to concentrate was the strongest predictor of success. Coleman said this, that could be a problem for students in the U.S. who often seem addicted to their devices. They're unable to put them down even for a few moments. Teachers say students are unable to comprehend the same texts that generations of students that came before them could master without problems. These are signs that educators may need to start paying attention to the act of attention itself. Now, of course, we're talking about it as parenting and as working with our young people, as working in our own lives. It's very important to amp up the focus side of the equation, Goleman said. He's not naive about the role digital devices play in society today, but he does believe that without managing how devices affect kids better, without doing that in a better way, they'll never learn the attention skills they'll need to succeed in the long term. Now listen to this, and we'll finish this quote here with this statement. He says, some argue that the current generations of students grew up with digital devices, and as a result, they're much better at multitasking than their parents are. Because I've got this going on, and I've got this going on, I can better multitask. But the idea of multitasking is a myth, Goleman said. When people say they're multitasking, listen to this. When people say they're multitasking, what they are really doing is something called continuous partial attention. That's what it is. Continuous partial attention, where the brain switches back and forth quickly between tasks. The problem is that a student switches back and forth between homework and streaming through text messages. Their ability to focus on either task erodes. That trend is less pronounced when the actions are routine, but it could have significant implications for how deeply a student or a person, or as a Christian, can understand concepts of life. Correlate this to our own lives. Parents, correlate this discussion to your life and your children's lives. Do we see evidence of such in our day-to-day activities, that it's just so much that we aren't ceasing to focus? Shouldn't the Sabbath that God made for mankind, that he made, that if we observed in the way that he designed for us, shouldn't it help us to focus? Shouldn't it help us to reflect? Shouldn't it help us to maintain and gain better perspective? Shouldn't it help us prioritize, to reset every week? How much time do we and our families devote to meditating, reflecting, praying, studying, spending time with God? Are your children, are you able to focus your thoughts? There are a bunch of exercises that can be done with that. One would be just simply to take your children out in nature, and bring a little pad with them, and they can draw, they can walk slowly, do like a mindful walkabout is one example, and just walk slowly and look at nature, look at the little caterpillar that's on the leaf, and to all of a sudden see that and stop and look and draw that, or write something about that. As I stopped and looked, I saw this, and dwell on that and think about that with this great God as creator who created that, and for what purpose, and this and that. But just to pull back and slow down and think deeply about creation, about all that we see around us. We know this, but it is so true, and it will grab a hold of us, and it has grabbed a hold of us at times. Satan's one of his greatest tools in influencing God's people at this time in life in a negative way is the tool of distraction. That's what he does. He is into that business. especially on a day that God has set aside for us weekly to pull back and reflect. Rejuvenation, a refreshed feeling that occurs through ceasing and resting, tied with worship, fellowship, all of that, creation appreciation, good food, interacting with one another, all of that. God gives that to us once a week. He gives that to us on the annual holy days. Western society is just becoming more and more surface-oriented instead of getting down to the deep things. We can digest incredible amounts of information very quickly. But anybody ever read the book by Ray Bradbury, Fahrenheit 451? Any of you read that? That was one of these dystopias back, I don't know when it was written, in 50s or 60s. Maybe it was, I think it was the 50s. But I remember reading that as a teen and thinking at the time, what in the world? But they had this thing set up where in the future, everybody was into entertainment and acting out these things that were going on TVs. And they set up walls of TV screens. And I thought, what? Walls of TV screens? There was a wall here and a wall there? What would that be like? And so I was thinking, how can they focus? Because we have one TV and it's about this big and it's black and white. Then we got the color one, and it always had that line through the middle. It took about 10 minutes for it to warm up for the line to go away. But the one TV. But now you go to a sports bar, you go anywhere. It's everywhere. It's multimedia, everything going on at the same time. And that was the world then that they talked about. That is the world now. Michel de Montaigne, a philosopher in France during the French Renaissance period, said this regarding thinking: no occupation is at once idler, I-D-L-E-R, and more fruitful. To pull back and think. Do you have to have the perfect spot to set up and reflect? Do you take time to get to a place where you can sit and think and reflect? My latest, it doesn't have to be a beautiful place. I like to get to a beautiful place, but my latest place, I just discovered this, probably shouldn't be sharing this with you, but if I lie flat on my back underneath my desk and put my feet up on my chair and pull my, the board that I type on, what's that called? Computer keyboard. If I pull that thing out, that blocks the light and I can lie under there and I can think. That's my reflection place at this point in my life. But to pull back and have that time to just block everything out and think about God's ways, to think about what His plan is and what He's doing with us. So much is going on now that it's getting more and more difficult to do so. Satan is systematically separating mankind from the Creator. And he's doing it by getting us away from His creation and into a virtual world of a screen. Very effective at that. And you think, how could he do that? How could he get people to focus on a screen this big and not see the beauty that's all around, to see the human beings that are all around, the human beings that are made in the image of God, the human beings that are part of the body of Christ to interact with and grow closer with and encourage and strengthen. And he's pulling mankind into this. Another way that he's working is to get those that aren't in that, those that are into creation. What are they about? They're about worshiping the creation. He gets them that way as well, or simply into the world of distractions, the affairs of mankind. Onto which false path do your feet tend to let you go if you do not keep focused on the true compass? Back to our specific topic at hand, let's go to Exodus 31. Exodus 31, because Exodus 31 gives us a very clear guideline about why it is so important and how God views it. Does God view it any differently today for God's people? Do God's people value this weekly ceasing, this weekly stopping that He's made for us, for our benefit, to grow closer to Him, to grow closer to one another, to grow in greater appreciation to Him as deliverer, liberator, and creator? It's serious business with God. It's very serious business. Exodus 31, verse 12. Exodus 31, verse 12. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, surely my Sabbaths." Now you read most commentaries and they'll say, well, when he says my Sabbaths, plural, he's talking about the 52 Sabbaths in a year. That's what he's talking about, the weekly Sabbath. That could be. I don't know that it's necessarily meaning that, though, as we look at Scripture and we see, as he's outlined here in this law of the annual Sabbaths and the weekly Sabbaths, that I believe it's that rest as well that Mr. Hogberg was talking about, that we're about to enjoy with the feast, this keeping of the annual as well as the weekly. But he says it's a sign between me and you throughout your generations. It's how we know we are connected. I, the Father, God, your Lord and Master, and you as my people, throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the eternal who makes you holy. I am the Lord who consecrates you. I am the Lord who sanctifies you. I am the Lord who kadashes you, to make or pronounce holy and clean. I am the one who does that. That's why we keep it. You shall keep the Sabbath, therefore, for it's holy to you. Everyone who profanes, everyone who defiles it, shall surely be put to death. It's being cut off from the people and being put to death. The Tanakh renders this next verse in verse 15, because sometimes people get tripped up with this. Work shall be done for 6 days, as in we must work 6 days. You cannot take a day off and take a break. That's not necessarily what it's saying. Tanakh renders it 6 days work may be done. But the seventh is the Sabbath of rest. It's holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day, he shall surely be put to death. Therefore, the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath. We are to observe that Sabbath throughout our generations as a perpetual covenant. Again, he says, it's a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. We are the spiritual children of Israel now. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he Shabbathed. S-H-A-B-A-T-H, he rested. He rested and was refreshed. So how are we doing that? Are we taking this time that God gives us weekly to be physically and spiritually refreshed? We should be refreshed physically by ceasing from our normal affairs. The NPR show was talking about how physiologically the body needs a resetting weekly. Mankind needs a resetting, a resting weekly. Mankind needs a series of resets and rest throughout the year. That's why we have the holy days, the annual holy days. It's a series of ceasing during the year to pull back and keep that perspective. Mankind needs a rest every 7 years. That's what we need. That's what God set up, is that we let the land lay fallow and we rest for a whole year. Mankind needs that. Mankind doesn't have it. Mankind needs a rest every 50 years. That's what God set in place with the Jubilee. Man doesn't have that. Mankind needs a rest every 6,000 years. Mankind needs to rest from his own affairs. Mankind has shown through his work and his labors of what it leads to. Mankind needs that 7,000th year rest, that 7,000th year of ceasing. But no, wait. Everything is getting better. Mankind's going to get it right. Ever since President Trump has been elected, look at how this nation has turned around. We knew it would happen. We knew there would be happiness and harmony within his group that he brings in. They would be able to turn things around and get this nation going in the direction that it needs to go. And start to bring even the Democrats around to seeing that this way really can work. We can do this as a country. How's that working for us 6 months in? Boy, we needed to get Trump in there because he's going to turn it around. And then what are others saying? Boy, I can't wait to get him out. When we can get him out and get a Democrat back in, I know Democrats aren't perfect, but at least they see the big picture. At least they're not bigoted. Some people think President Trump's a bigot. Some people think he's this. Some people think he's really got it all together. He's got some flaws, but he's really got it all together. But if we could just rally and quit fighting him, we could turn this country around. No, mankind cannot. Mankind is caught up in his own affairs. In the 6,000 years of man. It's not going to get better. And God's people, every Sabbath, we come together to recognize, as Hebrew 4 tells us, there remains a Sabbath-keeping for the people of God, a Sabbath ceasing for the people of God, to see that that rest is desperately needed. That we have entered that rest now as a foretaste of the rest that we will experience, as a foretaste of the rest that we need this nation and this world desperately to experience. That's where God's people keep their minds focused. That's why they don't go for the squirrels of who's in power, and the squirrels of who's going to be in charge of the mayorship in Dallas, and who's going to be the head of the police, and who's going to get this border situation under control, and who's going to take care of Iran and Iraq, and who's going to take care of North Korea, who's going to take care of China, who's going to take care of Russia, who's going to take care of all of that. It's the affairs of man. And God's people, every Sabbath, we pull back and we see mankind needs a rest. This is not going to be solved. And we have perspective as we pull back and we think deeply about God's way of life. So critical for God's people to continue to keep that focus. Let's turn finally, if we could, to Isaiah 56. Isaiah 56. We know that it doesn't matter who's in power. The world needs a complete overhaul. The world needs a complete rest. The world needs a complete ceasing from its ungodly, sinful works. That's what mankind needs. That's what Hebrews 4 talks about. We won't turn there, but it talks about we keep the Sabbath, we keep that rest, we enter into God's rest because we reflect upon the fact that we are ceasing from our ungodly works in our day in and day out lives. We reflect on that every time we come to keep God's Sabbath every week. Every Sabbath we reflect that there remains a Sabbath rest, a Sabbatismos, as it says in Hebrews, for the people of God. The people of God at creation, when God created Adam and established the Sabbath, the people of God during Israel's time, the people of God during the early New Testament church, the people of God present day, there remains a Sabbath-keeping for the people of God at the very end when Christ is about to return. Because what's Matthew 24 say? It says, pray that your flight be not on the Sabbath day. Well, why does it matter if the Sabbath's not valid? The Sabbath still being kept all the way up till the time of Christ, and of course we know as well on into the millennium. There remains a Sabbath ceasing for you and me. Isaiah 56, as I mentioned, we'll finish there. I'll read this from the Tanakh. But through the Sabbath day that he made for us, this ceasing, that he and the Lord of the Sabbath, in keeping this in the way that they intend, we're able to grasp that weekly reminder of Mr. Meeker's sermon. Live like you were dying. Live this temporary life with the purpose and meaning and thankfulness for what we're given and for what lies ahead. As we use God's Sabbath day as he made for us in the way that he intended, we do what Mr. Kylo was talking about, that whole thing of, again, we see our calling. We see our calling. We see our purpose. We see what it's all about as we continue to meet and interact with one another and come out of this world and cease from our own works. Isaiah 56, verse 1. I love this passage. We'll read through verse 8 and conclude. Isaiah 56, verse 1. I'm reading out of the Tanakh, and it reads backwards. It starts on the right side and moves left, so it's a bit tricky. Sorry. Isaiah 56, verse 1. Thus says the Lord, observe what is right and do what is just. For soon my salvation shall come, and my deliverance be revealed. Happy is the man who does this, the man who holds fast to it, the one who keeps the Sabbath and does not profane it, and stays his hand from doing any evil. Even he says to the foreigner, let not the foreigner say, the foreigner who's attached himself to the Lord, don't let that person say, well, the Lord will keep me apart from his people. He says, no, don't let them say that. Don't let the eunuch say, I'm a withered tree. For thus said the Lord, as for the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who have chosen what I desire and hold fast to my covenant, I'll give them in my house and within my walls a monument and a name better than sons or daughters. I'll give them an everlasting name which shall not perish. As for the foreigners who attach themselves to the Lord to minister to him and to love the name of the Lord, to be his servants, all who keep the Sabbath and do not profane it and hold fast to my covenant, I'll bring them to my sacred mount and let them rejoice in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and sacrifices shall be welcome on my altar. For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. Thus declares the Lord God, who gathers the dispersed of Israel. I will gather still more to those already gathered.